We are so excited to welcome back Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. He is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and one of our favorite people to talk to on the show. Senator, it's great to see you again.
What's up, guys? Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the big news out of Iran. A scientist named Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, an Iranian nuclear scientist, was assassinated last week, reportedly by the Israeli government. I've seen you tweeted your reaction to some of this news. Has that been updated at all by any additional information you've gotten, or have you gotten a briefing from the administration? Like, what is your sense so far of what happened and what we know?
We have not received any briefings from the administration as of yet. As you both know, it is unlikely that anything like this happens without U.S. knowledge, more likely United States approval, and perhaps United States participation. There's a good reason why we don't assassinate foreign leaders, because when we engage in that kind of behavior, it ultimately lends an authority to that kind of action that can ultimately boomerang on the United States. It was a reason why we pressed the Israelis to forego these kind of actions during the 8 years of the Obama administration. And if this is really about trying to tie the hands of the Biden administration with respect to re-entering the nuclear agreement, it's absolutely disastrous because there is no path to a safer Middle East without our ability to restart at least some elements of that agreement. And so we don't have all the full details. We have not been briefed inside Congress about this. But if the United States had something to do with this, it is going to accrue to the detriment of America's security, both in the short run and in the long run.
I share, obviously, your cynicism. When there's somebody that we've known about for 20 years and he just happens to get assassinated a few weeks before a new president takes office, makes you ask questions about the timing. But we see not only this assassination, we've seen a lot of sanctions added on top of the existing sanctions that have been reimposed on Iran because of this decision by Trump to leave the JCPOA. It feels like they're just throwing up as many obstacles as possible to returning to the deal itself. At the same time, I know there's going to be pressure on the new administration to not come back into the JCPOA unless Iran agrees to negotiate follow-on agreements. If we're just looking at the potential for a clean return, the Iranians come into the JCPOA, America comes back in, what do you think the appetite is in Congress for that? What is the current support for just no follow-on agreements have to be added to this? There's an understanding that some of the sanctions that have been imposed on top of this may have to be relaxed too because they're additive to what was part of the JCPOA. Is there support, in your view, in Congress for that kind of just clean return? Or do you think Congress is going to seek to put itself in the middle of the policy and try to put conditions on the administration to add bells and whistles to the old agreement?
I don't think the dividing lines on this issue have fundamentally changed over the last 4 years. I don't think that there are Democrats that supported the JCPOA that now would draw a new line. I also don't think there are a lot of converts to our side. I don't think there are likely many Republicans that have changed their mind. They want all of these issues to be litigated. The problem for Republicans is that they have now had 4 years to test their theory of the case, right? Donald Trump came in, obliterated the JCPOA, and articulated the Republican case, which is that we should ramp up sanctions, sort of blow past the levels that were in place prior to the JCPOA as a means of getting the Iranians to come to the table on everything. And Mike Pompeo wrote down what everything was, right? He had these 12 demands of the Iranians. He had 4 years to effectuate this policy. And he didn't just fail. Pompeo failed miserably, right? Not only did he not get the Iranians to the table on any of his 12 demands, the Iranians got closer to a nuclear weapon. They're now 2 months away rather than 12 months away. They started shooting at American troops inside Iraq, something they weren't doing when Donald Trump took over. And so while Republicans are going to object to getting back into the deal, they really don't have a leg to stand on because we've tried their way. and it didn't work. So I think the support exists certainly within the Democratic Party for Biden to re-enter the agreement. But remember, there are two sides here, and the Iranians are also going to ask for more, right? The Iranians are going to say, well, we want reparations for all the damage done to our economy once you walked away. And, we shouldn't be willing to agree to that, but we should also just understand that it's not just the United States that's going to be driving a hard bargain. If we're back at the table with the Iranians, they're going to be driving a hard bargain as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned possible U.S. knowledge of or participation in this assassination of the scientist. So, this question is a bit in the weeds, so I hope you'll endure me and my Wikipedia level knowledge of these issues. But the U.S. government banned political assassination in 1976. It was Executive Order 11905 by President Ford. It was sort of reining in some of the worst excesses of the intelligence community in the 50s and 60s. That EO was updated a couple of times by Carter and by Reagan to ban indirect U.S. involvement in assassinations, political assassinations. So my question is killing a scientist a political assassination? What category does that fall into? And therefore, would it be illegal under U.S. law to be indirectly involved in killing this individual in Iran?
Yeah, and we could do an entire podcast on the law of assassinations because you are right. It is an executive order. Interestingly, though, it is not a statute. Right? Congress has actually never weighed in on this question, but it has been a long-standing executive order that has been reaffirmed by Republican and Democratic administrations. I think the answer to your question, Tommy, is of course a scientist is a political figure because in this case there are very few political appointees in Iran who matter more than the chief nuclear scientist. This guy didn't sort of rise through the meritocratic ranks. He was appointed by the political leadership, endorsed by the political leadership of Iran to effectuate a political goal, which is either the effectuation of a civilian nuclear program or the ability to ramp that up into a pathway to a nuclear weapon. So I don't see how you could make the case, and I'm not sure the Trump administration would even try, that this wouldn't be banned under the existing executive order.
One of the dynamics of the assassination, of course, is that I think all of us looking at this from the outside would assume, there's an Israeli role in this in some fashion. The Israelis have not been particularly subtle about, not sending that signal. And we've talked before on this show about Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, the U.S. partners in the region who've kind of felt obviously very emboldened under Trump. I noticed your complaint last night on Twitter around the briefing you received about the massive arms sale to the UAE, the F-35, one of our most sophisticated pieces of machinery, Reaper drones, which can, kill civilians in places like Yemen, where the Emiratis have been engaged in a war the last few years for destructive purposes. This was not a part of the splashy announcement of the Abraham Accords, which was cast as a peace agreement. Most peace agreements, don't come with under the table massive sales of F-35s and Reaper drones. And there have been reports even as recently as the last 24 hours about the UAE even kind of supporting proxies against the wrong people in Libya. What is your concern about this arms sale? And the most important question is Biden on the hook for this? Or can Congress play a role here? Do you think the new administration should pause this? Or was this kind of committed on behalf of the U.S. as a part of this Abraham Accords formula, and are the Emiratis going to put that into play if the arms are withheld?
Yeah, a ton of really important questions there. First, we all have to assume that there was some invisible ink on the Abraham Accords, and that when you reveal it, you find Reaper drones. And so I do think there will be a question as to whether the UAE feels like it has to make good on its commitments if the United States doesn't ultimately deliver all of the weapons in this sale. And by the way, this is a dizzying array of lethal arms that we have never, ever been willing to send into the Middle East. Why on earth does the Middle East need Reaper drones? Never mind F-35s, especially when the recipient of these drones has been regularly participating in the killing of civilians, either by accident or on purpose, inside of Yemen. So I think the briefing that we got last night, I hope, was equally disturbing to Republicans and Democrats. It was crystal clear that the administration is rushing this sale through and has not dotted I's and crossed T's, that the Emiratis have all sorts of commitments they would need to make that they have not yet made in order to receive these weapons. And so without getting into the details of how this sale is structured, it is likely that even if Congress couldn't overturn this sale before the end of the year, there would be an awful lot still to do under a Biden administration, and that the Biden administration may have some ability to hold back some of these weapons or place new conditions on them. It's just impossible, as you know, to get this large a sale actually done and completed before January 20th. And my hope is that whether or not this gets sort of officially noticed before Biden takes office, he'll take a fresh look at whether there's wisdom in giving this level of arms to a country that has a history of violating arms embargoes, transferring weapons to Salafist militias inside the Middle East, and occasionally killing civilians with the weapons we've already given them.
So speaking of the Biden team, the president-elect has named several members of his national security team. There's more to come. I guess the subhead of this interview is that you're a good Twitter follow, and I was reading the thread you had the other day about the ways U.S. foreign policy has become sclerotic and dangerously rigid and inflexible, basically. Can you talk us through what you think some of those problems are, and do you think, from what you've seen so far, that this is the right team to address the ways that U.S. foreign policy has been stagnant and not address the changing world around it?
Yeah, I love everyone individually who's been appointed to this team. I don't know all of them well, but those that I do are smart, they're principled, and many of them are very open to these new ideas. Specifically, I've talked to Tony Blinken at length about my belief that we have become, as I said in that thread, sclerotic in the tools that we deploy. I mean, today we essentially sell weapons to our friends and we sanction our adversaries. And we are sort of left with a really narrow set of options when we're trying to protect our interests around the globe. So, I've made the case that we should be doubling, at the very least, the size of our smart power tools, right? Things like hard dollars to use to make countries energy independent of Russia, real resources to combat propaganda around the world, not just a couple, extra dollars thrown to, Twitter threads. And I think this team is open to it. Would I like to see somebody on the national security team that has not served in office before? Sure. I think it serves every president to have some folks at the upper echelon of their national security team who come in as real outsiders. But the folks that have been named so far, I think, are open to some of these new ideas. But I will add that a lot of this is dependent upon Congress. The president plays the cards that he has in his hand, and it's the budget that gives the president cards. So long as Congress keeps approving budgets where we spend 20 times as much money on defense and intelligence as we do on the State Department and USAID, there's not much the president can do with that limited toolkit.
One question I think is also how to manage this transition from this very unusual team that's leaving. I noticed that Jared Kushner's on his way to see his buddy Mohammed bin Salman one more time.
It's going to the bank.
Going to trying to get that back end payoff for 4 years of good service. But to me, it begs the question, not just from a legal perspective, but really from a foreign policy perspective, Senator, as someone who's looked at things like the Saudi relationship, the Turkey relationship, where there have been all these concerns about corruption and what kind of deals were actually made that we don't even know about. Do you think that part of trying to change the nature of our foreign policy is also going to have to be taking a look back and trying to figure out what happened within these relationships. Again, not legal investigations, but in terms of Congress as an oversight role, you'll have a cooperative administration when it comes to things like witnesses and documents. Like, do you think that looking back at the conduct and potential corruption of some of these relationships that we've discussed is worth doing, or do you think that could prove to be a kind of a divisive distraction?
No, I think it's required. We need to understand, why we have endured these bizarre turns in policy. We need to understand why Erdogan can pick up the phone and 5 minutes later get a dramatic 180-degree orientation of American policy in Syria. We need to understand why our Saudi Arabia policy went so quickly off the rails. The question is, can we find the answers? I mean, some of this may be that, Trump just wanted to do anything that Mohammed bin Salman wanted or Erdogan wanted because he knew that after he left, he would get more favorable business treatment. And so there may be no paper trail there. There might be no secret deal. It may just be that Trump was trying to be nice to folks who, ultimately could pad his pockets once he left office. And to the extent there is a paper trail, you have to make sure that it remains. And so a lot of what we need to do right now is put some pressure on these departments to not burn the documents. And so I've already sent correspondence to a couple agencies to, make sure that they're complying with the Presidential Records Act, and that, whether it's their private email feeds or their public paper trails, that they're not destroying any of it.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure Jared is archiving all those WhatsApps to Mohammed bin Salman.
Right.
Not to be cynical. So speaking of cynical, a lot of your colleagues on the Republican side are finding a newfound interest in vetting and qualifications for nominees. I've heard concerns that some of Biden's nominees might not get committee votes. Neera Tanden was put up for the office, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. John Cornyn's spokesman suggested that because she had sent mean tweets about Republicans, that might be a non-starter. What do you make of this, newfound interest in vetting? Are you concerned that McConnell and the gang might try to be actually looking to veto some of Biden's team, or are they just looking for, a few individuals to take down as, to make news?
John Cornyn went to the floor today, like hours ago, and gave a whole speech about how he wasn't going to confirm anybody unless there was a full disclosure made as to the foreign business relationships of that nominee. That just gives you an indication as to how the sort of short-term memory phenomenon is going to play out in the Republican caucus, right? They are going to hold themselves to zero precedents. They are going to hold themselves to nothing that they said, to no defenses that they mounted of President Trump over the past 4 years. And nobody should expect them to, because they are shameless about it. Yeah. They are shameless. There is no ounce of contrition in their soul. And so you shouldn't think that they are going to feel any pressure to treat Biden's nominees like they treated Donald Trump. Now, the question is, are they going to be so unreasonable in the standards that they set that we're going to have a crisis right off the bat, in that the president-elect can't get any of his cabinet named? I think that will be difficult for them to do. I think that they really do risk a backlash from the public if they are stopping the entirety of Biden's national security team or his domestic team from being placed. So I think they probably will pick their spots. They won't necessarily be logic behind who they fight, but they're going to probably have to fight a few out just to prove to their base that they aren't providing 100% support. But I don't think that this is going to be a constitutional crisis in a way that I might have feared a month ago. I've talked to enough Republican senators that I believe that there's a pathway to get a good chunk, the vast majority of Biden's cabinet picks approved.
I hope that's true. I mean, in 2009, our experience was it seemed like once Republicans sort of took down Tom Daschle, they let some individuals who you would have thought had worse vetting problems through eventually. But I'll knock on wood, I guess.
Yeah, whatever bottom was there in 2009 and wasn't much doesn't seem to be there. But one last question, Senator. As you and I have talked about democracy a lot, and how can the United States kind of help mobilize democratic forces around the world that have been under siege. And I think that the assumption that a lot of people like you and I had is if there was a Democratic Senate, that the best thing we could do is a comprehensive democratic set of reforms in this country, an HR 1 type effort on voting rights and the wiring of democracy. That may be difficult in the event that the Republicans maintain control of the Senate or in a 50-50 Democratic Senate. What do you think the Biden team should do coming in? What is the most important thing that they can do? Beyond the kind of rhetoric about we're back and we're in support of values again, concretely, how do you think we can restore some sense of democratic example or some sense of momentum to those forces from Belarus to Hong Kong to wherever who want to be able to see something hopeful in the United States related to democracy?
Well, I mean, Ben, you and I have talked about this a lot, and I think part of what's important here, and you've led in a lot of this thought already, is creating a real common purpose amongst democracies in the world to give democracies a sense that there's a new reason to be part of the club, because the reason for most of the last 100 years was to combat Soviet aggression, right? And that kind of that's not as relevant today, put it that way. But we haven't replaced it with something new. The rise of China presents democracies with an opportunity, right, to sort of understand what you get for membership. If we have a coherent strategy between the United States, Europe, and frankly, democracies in Asia that are not so excited about China dominating their economic sphere, then we have a reason to invest in the project. It does, though, mean drawing a line, right, and sort of saying who's in the club and who's out of the club. Part of what has been part of the disaster of the last 4 years has been that there's been zero cost applied to countries that have slipped out of the club. And so that's a difficult exercise, sort of saying to a nation, hey, listen, you're no longer with us, and there's consequences for sort of going the way of Orban. But at some point, if you don't deliver consequences to anybody, you don't kick anybody out of the club, it becomes difficult to keep folks in. So I think that common purpose is going to be important.
Senator Chris Murphy, author of the book, The Violence Inside Us. I should have mentioned that. Fantastic book. Great Twitter follow, U.S. Senator. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Good talking.